Hi everyone, welcome to The Pivot. My name is Arif Rafiq and I'm your host. On January 1st, landlocked Ethiopia signed an agreement with Somaliland that, according to some reports, would provide it with access to a naval base and port in exchange for recognition of this breakaway region of Somalia. Then, 2 months later, the federal government of Somalia secured an agreement with Turkey to build its naval forces and explore offshore oil and gas reserves. These two sets of deals highlight the growing competition between local, regional, and great powers in the strategically located area known as the Horn of Africa. This part of East Africa, which consists of Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia, sits along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, across from the Arabian Peninsula and along the vital trade route that connects Europe with Asia and southern Africa. We're now seeing a scramble for ports and military bases in this region involving not just the United States and China, but also middle powers like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey. This contestation of power takes place in a volatile region divided by clan, ethnicity, nationality, and religion, a region that's seen many civil wars and insurgencies. So, to unpack the complicated relationship between the domestic politics and geopolitics of the Horn of Africa, we're joined by Dr. Michael Woldemariam, an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Woldemariam is the author of Insurgent Fragmentation in the Horn of Africa, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. He's a leading expert on the politics and security of the Horn of Africa. And just a note before we begin, if you're unfamiliar with the region's geography, and it's really important to understanding this episode, I encourage you to pull up a map of the Horn of Africa and East Africa. We've got a link to one in the show notes. And now to our show. Dr. Woldemariam, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So Ethiopia and Somaliland signed this MOU in early January that's been described as exchanging diplomatic recognition for access to a commercial port and naval base. Now, the details of this MOU are murky, and there's some conflicting reports about how Ethiopia and Somaliland respectively describe it. But before we get into the deal, I'd like you to help our listeners understand Ethiopia's problem of geography. It's the world's largest landlocked country by population, big country, 126 million people, second largest in Africa. Talk to us about how Ethiopia views this problem of geography and how it's tried to address it, this challenge of being landlocked over the past couple of decades.
Sure, happy to do that. As you noted, Arif, Ethiopia is the most populous landlocked country in the world by a considerable margin. I think the next most populous landlocked country in the world is probably Uganda. And Uganda has a little less than half of Ethiopia's population. Right? Ethiopia is about 120 million people today. And I think importantly, a lot of the parts of Ethiopia with a large population, so the parts of the country that are most densely populated, tend to be pretty far away from the Horn of Africa littoral. So I think that's sort of an added issue. And I think since about the late 1990s, when Ethiopia lost access to Eritrean ports, Djibouti has really been the only outlet for Ethiopian goods and services. So just to walk you through a little history, I think historical context is relevant. Ethiopia is federated with Eritrea in the 1950s, so it uses Eritrean ports as its own from 1952 to 1991. Eritrea becomes independent in 1991, and throughout much of the 1990s, Ethiopia has a port arrangement with an independent Eritrean state through which their use of ports is facilitated, particularly the Eritrean port of Asab, which is just about 50-60 kilometers from the Ethiopian border. But Ethiopia and Eritrea fight a war, have a falling out of sorts in 1998, and it's in that context that Ethiopia shifts its port access to Djibouti. So Djibouti now accounts for over 90% of flow of Ethiopian goods and services in terms of port access. And so in part because there's sort of a lack of competition in terms of port access for Ethiopia and inability to diversify, pays pretty significant port fees, service charges to Djibouti for use of that port. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 billion dollars a year. And that's pretty significant when you consider the fact that Ethiopia's export earnings on an annual basis are just several billion dollars. I mean, depending on the year, $4 or $5 billion, something along those lines. And so that's a pretty significant constraint on Ethiopia's two-way trade. It really undermines its competitiveness in economic terms. And so, I think under the prime ministership of Abiy Ahmed, who becomes prime minister of Ethiopia in 2018, Ethiopia's really looked to diversify its ports away from Djibouti, and actually looked for other port options within Djibouti as well, because primarily they've been using Djibouti, the port of Djibouti City, but Djibouti also has some other ports. And so that's really the conundrum from Ethiopia's perspective when we put it in historical relief. I'll also just add that the port question from Ethiopia's view is not simply an economic issue. It's also a national security concern, right? So Ethiopia is seeking, and I think the terms of the MOU suggest this, is not simply seeking access to ports for commercial purposes, but also wants naval installations, military bases on the Horn of Africa littoral. And I think part of the argument that has been made is that, look, the Horn of Africa is a difficult region. It's a region with multiple threats from state and non-state actors. The Horn of Africa is a geopolitical hot zone with a lot of intervention from extra-regional actors. Ethiopia has historically had difficult relations with its neighbors, and so cannot really guarantee its secure access to ports if it does not have a maritime presence on the Horn of Africa littoral. So you see kind of two imperatives. There's a kind of pure economic commercial imperative, but also national security arguments, I think, that have been made. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And when we talk about Abiy's motives, you've identified some very material, tangible interests involved. But is there also a domestic factor at play? Some have described Prime Minister Abiy as a nationalist, and some are alleging that he's using this to drum up nationalistic sentiment with elements of his support base at home. Is that a factor too?
I think it is relevant. And I think you'd have to look at Ethiopian politics historically, but even since 2018 and Abiy's rise, to sort of understand the domestic political calculus. I mean, Ethiopia has always been a state where those that occupy the mantle of state power in Addis Ababa have faced multiple challenges, oftentimes challenges that exist in the form of violent mobilization, violent insurgencies against a central state. That was true in the 1960s, and it is, of course, true in Ethiopia today. If you followed the news on Ethiopia since 2020, you'll know that between 2020 and 2022, there was a pretty significant civil conflict in the Tigray region that pitted Tigrayan armed groups against the central government. There is an active insurgency in the Amhara and the Oromo regions of Ethiopia, which are Ethiopia's two most populous regions, really important to the country's overall trajectory. I think since 2018, there are quarters and segments of the Ethiopian society that feel sort of disaffected with the trajectory of the country, with Abiy's rule. Of course, Abiy and his government do have support from certain quarters of the country, but it's really against the backdrop of those internal problems, those internal challenges, which have some historical precedent, right? Ethiopia went through a period of pretty significant civil conflict in the 1970s and 1980s. That this deal on port access has been struck. And some would make the argument that it is a way of distracting, reflecting away from these internal issues. It's a way of cultivating nationalist support amongst various segments of Ethiopian society. So again, those arguments are made. I mean, I will say that if that is the strategy, it's not exactly clear it will pay dividends. I mean, I think those most likely to offer support for the prime minister on the basis of port ambitions were probably already likely to be supportive of the prime minister. I'm not sure those that oppose or have been disaffected with the government are necessarily going to kind of change their political stripes because of Ethiopia's recent sort of maneuvering around ports. But I think the domestic politics is also important in another way, and that is, I think the Ethiopian government understands that there will be political gains if they are able to put the country on a sustainable development trajectory. Right? Ethiopia is a country that is very young, where there are many young people that are looking for jobs and employment opportunities, and where you have a labor market that structurally has really been unable to meet the needs of this youth demographic. So there's been a huge expansion, for instance, of tertiary education in Ethiopia over the last 3 decades. You've got about a million, last time I looked, graduates, college graduates entering the workforce each year. And there simply isn't labor market to support those graduates, and certainly not sufficient labor opportunities even for young people further on down the educational hierarchy. And the solution, I think many decision makers in Ethiopia would argue, is to really catalyze an export-oriented transformation strategy, industrialization strategy. But in order for that to succeed, the argument would go is that you need sustainable, reliable port access that can keep transportation costs down and make sure that industrial sector is competitive. So just to summarize the point, yes, I think the domestic calculations are political and about mobilizing support from certain constituencies, but there's also an underlying desire to reap economic gains that themselves will have a domestic political dividends.
Right. And successive Ethiopian governments have invested quite a bit of energy and resources into developing a domestic infrastructure to cultivate an export-oriented economy with sort of low levels of manufacturing, attracting investment from Chinese companies, and also leveraging Chinese financing and construction expertise to build these networks, but for exports. But they have to reach outside markets, and if you're landlocked, you have to do it through one or a number of your neighboring states. So that problem of geography that we've been talking about is, as you note, is intimately linked to this question of development and Ethiopia's progress as a country through this kind of export-oriented model of growth. Now, you noted Ethiopia is a young country, but it's also home to an old civilization. And so I wonder how much that self-perception plays a role in all this. Does it feel that its strategic weight is being diminished by being cut off from the sea by these smaller states? And how would you describe its strategic culture? Is it irredentist in some ways?
It's a good question, and in some sense a difficult question to answer because of Ethiopia's social and political diversity, but also the fact that if we look at the modern Ethiopian state, which is really a creation of the late 19th century, I mean, there are older historical antecedents, but the state of Ethiopia as we see it today, its territorial boundaries, its political structures, really a creation of the late 19th century. And since that time, we've had about 4 different regimes that have governed the country, right? We had the imperial era under Menelik and Haile Selassie. We had the Derg, sort of communist regime of the 1970s and 1980s. We had the EPRDF, in which the Tigray People's Liberation Front, a political organization from the north of the country, was really the prominent figure in that ruling coalition. And then, of course, API. And each of these governments and the leaderships are ideologically really quite disparate, different foreign policy perspectives. But I mean, that caveat aside, I think there is kind of some constants in sort of strategic worldview that are worth noting. I think one is this idea that Ethiopia really is or should be the preeminent power in the Horn of Africa region, right? By dint of, as we've discussed before, its size in terms of land mass, but in terms of population, I think more importantly, right? It really dwarfs other countries in the region in terms of demography. The size of its economy, it's now the Horn of Africa's largest economy, having surpassed Kenya a number of years ago. And then also there is kind of Ethiopia's historic diplomatic weight, right? The seat of the African Union, right? Africa's premier continental organization. One also has to remember that Ethiopia is a country that has never been colonized beyond a brief Italian interlude from 1936 to 1941, and has spent much of the 20th century as really the only indigenous power in the Horn of Africa region, right? And so for these reasons, right, some historical, some economic, there is a view that Ethiopia ought to have, should have, and must act in a way that places it as a regional hegemon. I think it's oftentimes described in softer terms, but I think that imperative, that ambition, is an important part of Ethiopian strategic culture. That's not to say that cooperation with neighbors is not appropriate, that shouldn't be pursued. But this idea of Ethiopia as kind of the most significant player in the region, I think, is important. But there's a contradiction, I think, in Ethiopia's strategic worldview when you look at it sort of foreign policy perspective. When you look at it across the various regimes, and that is, on the one hand, as I stated, Ethiopia is the most important player in the region, but it's also historically a somewhat insecure and vulnerable state that faces multiple challenges. Right, it faces challenges from neighbors that it hasn't always got along with, Eritrea, the state of Somalia, which we may talk more about, even Sudan in an earlier period, and actually quite recently. I mean, a couple of years ago, relations between Addis and Khartoum, particularly the military in Khartoum, were really quite significant and beset by challenges over territorial disputes, the war in Tigray, and so on. There are also external challenges in terms of extra-regional players. So Ethiopia historically, less so under Abiy, but certainly under his predecessors, historically has had a very difficult relationship with states from the Middle East, and has been historically suspicious of the role of Middle Eastern powers in the Horn of Africa. And then, of course, one can't forget Ethiopia's historical rivalry with Egypt, which is primarily about the Nile and how to use that as an asset. And then, of course, these foreign policy challenges link with a number of internal challenges within Ethiopia. That's been the historical pattern. In some ways, this is the pattern today, which is Ethiopia was creation of the late 19th century, and it came together through a process of violent consolidation, where a number of enterprising rulers from the highlands of Ethiopia, now we're talking the 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century, begin to expand the landmass of what is now the modern Ethiopian state and incorporate, through a process of violent consolidation, peripheral peoples of Ethiopia in the south. This would also include the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia today, the Oromo people. And that process of violent consolidation has produced an interesting and important conflicts in Ethiopia about how this state should be structured and about what the proper balance of power should be between Ethiopia's various ethnic communities, right? It's a very, very diverse country because of this process of consolidation. And the external challenges that I had mentioned a moment ago have oftentimes converged with these internal challenges, where external adversaries have, for one reason or another, decided to back various communities in Ethiopia that have a difficult relationship with Ethiopian state power. And so, again, when I speak about a contradiction in Ethiopian foreign policy or the Ethiopia strategic worldview, it really is, to summarize, on the one hand, this idea of Ethiopia as a regional hegemon, but also an Ethiopia that is incredibly vulnerable, right, to a variety of internal and external challenges that have converged and are linked in important ways. Now, you might ask, okay, where does Ethiopia's recent push to the sea sort of fit in to this contradiction? I mean, how does it mesh with some of with the dynamic I've described? Well, I think, obviously one of the reasons Ethiopia, I think, wants sea access beyond the sort of practical realities that are important I've described before is this idea that in order to be a regional power, right, Ethiopia has to have reliable access to the sea, right, and make its presence felt in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, in the Horn of Africa littoral, like preceding empires that resided on the Ethiopian landmass, like the Aksumite Empire had done in earlier eras, right? But I think the push to the sea or the ambition to acquire sea access also speaks to some of the vulnerabilities and insecurities that I've mentioned before, right? The fact that there are all of these extra regional powers that have a presence on the Horn of Africa littoral, that are maneuvering, that are making their presence felt in various ways, and that if Ethiopia is going to deal with that reality, it also needs to cultivate itself as a naval, as a maritime power.
Right. And setting aside the legality or the legal issues, it definitely is, paradoxical that you have a country that has these elements of national power and it's recognized to some degree by outside powers as a regional force, but it's constrained by virtue of being landlocked. And it's a definite strategic vulnerability, but that's a distinct issue from the legality of, having access to these areas.
Yeah, and I would just add, to underscore the point. Yeah, we do have to distinguish, and I want to be sort of very clear about this, the sort of the sort of practical arguments for Ethiopian access to the sea from the sort of legal questions. And I think a lot of critics of Ethiopian maneuvering more recently would point, I think, to what they would see as the absence of a real legal argument for the kind of sea access, sort of direct control of a port that Ethiopia appears or seems to be seeking. And part of, I mean, if we talk about the MOU, the Somaliland-Ethiopia MOU, I mean, part of the legal controversy turns on the fact, of course, that Somaliland is not a recognized state, right? It is a de facto state with whom Ethiopia has struck a bargain with on sea access.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to get to that deal. So it's controversial because Somaliland isn't an internationally recognized country. So you have a sovereign country making an agreement with an entity that may have de facto status as a kind of autonomous entity. How exactly would you characterize Somaliland's status within the Somalia Federation? It seems to me like it's similar in some ways to Iraqi Kurdistan. Would that be an accurate comparison?
No, I think there are parallels, but I would even argue, and I'm no expert on Iraq, but I would argue that Somaliland probably maintains more of the properties of an independent state than Iraqi Kurdistan. Again, not being an expert on the latter, right? I mean, this is a territory since 1991, that has all the sort of components, I think, of sort of juridical state. I mean, it has a landmass in which Somaliland's forces control. It administers territory in other ways in terms of collecting taxes. It delivers services. And so on. Although I would say on the service delivery front, Somaliland's a historically minimalist state. And since 1991, political authorities in Mogadishu, right, have really exercised no control over what has happened in Somaliland, right? I mean, Somaliland's government, multiple administrations have governed that territory without really any reference to what's happening in Mogadishu. And, I could talk a little bit more about how Somaliland came to this point, right? Sort of really robust de facto statehood. And it was really a result or an outgrowth of the way in which the Somali Civil War played out in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And so from the early 1980s onwards, there was a civil war in Somalia that pitted a variety of clan-based insurgencies against the military regime or the regime of Mohammed Siad Barre. Siad Barre being a military man that took power in a coup in Mogadishu in 1969. And he is ousted in early 1991 by this constellation of armed insurgencies. But what happens in early 1991 is these insurgencies can actually not agree on a framework for governing the country going forward. And so what ends up happening is state authority in Mogadishu collapses, and the country is basically carved up by these competing clan militias that set up de facto states or something akin to it effectively in their clan homelands. And what happens in the north is in Somaliland, what is now Somaliland, a armed group called the SNM, the Somali National Movement, primarily based on the Isak clan in Somaliland, obtains control of what is now Somaliland and decides, in part because of kind of popular sentiment, to declare independence. And really, after that juncture, Somaliland is pretty much on its own.
Right, and we'll unpack that a bit more later. But, the federal government of Somalia is naturally affronted by what it sees as the violation of its sovereignty. And the Ethiopia factor in this respect is a sensitive issue in Somalia, right? Didn't Ethiopia invade Somalia in 2006?
Well, I think you've made an important point here. Ethiopia and Somalia have had a historically difficult relationship. And that actually extends far beyond 2006, right? So, when Somalia becomes an independent country in the early 1960s, one important imperative for Somalia is the reunification of all Somali-speaking parts of the Horn that had been subdivided by colonial boundaries. And that includes a large speaking Somali-speaking territory, Somali-speaking population in Ethiopia, and particularly the Haud and the Ogaden region of Ethiopia. And so that set of claims drove Ethiopia and Somalia into conflict. Really beginning in the 1960s, they fought a very significant war, the Ogaden War, between 1977 and 1978. Ethiopia backed some of the clan-based insurgencies I'd been referencing a moment ago during the 1980s that end up toppling Siad Barre. And then after 1991, in this moment where the Somali state collapsed, you're absolutely right that the Ethiopian state has periodically intervened militarily in Somalia as a way of addressing or warding off any particular threats that they think might emanate from Somali territory. In 2006, as you note, that included the Islamic Courts Union, which was an Islamist movement that had some success in 2006 in reconsolidating the central Somali state. Again, it is against this historical backdrop, this backdrop of real difficulty in the bilateral relationship, that the MOU between Somalia and Ethiopia has taken place. And I think the feeling is amongst many Somalis, particularly political elites in Mogadishu, is that this MOU, right, this bargain that is being struck between Addis and Hargeisa, is an extension of the historical sort of enmity, or the historic antipathy. This is their framing, not mine, that Ethiopian elites have had towards Somalia, because what they are seeking to do, again, this is a perception, is divide Somalia, is fragment Somalia into its component units.
Right. And we have these two somewhat fragmented states that also have, their elements in both countries and have these visions of a greater Ethiopia and a greater Somalia. And I think to some extent we saw this in comments, and they were subject to many different interpretations by Congressman Ilhan Omar several weeks ago. And so that caused a bit of a controversy, not just in the Somali diaspora, sure, but in the right-wing ecosystem here as well. And it's probably a bit too complicated for our discussion.
Yeah, and if I could add one more point, Arif, just to make sure I'm doing the historical record justice, right? When we look at the historical enmity, difficulty in the bilateral relationship between Ethiopia and Somalia, I mean, certainly it is true that after independence, the Somali state sort of pushed up against the African consensus on colonial boundaries and laid claims to some territories, Somali-speaking territories that weren't Ethiopia proper. But certainly in the late 50s as well, I mean, Ethiopia laid claim to some Somali territories as well, particularly the port of Zayla that's now in Somaliland. And back in the 1950s, these claims were made on Somali territory. This was then British Somaliland, with the intent of gaining access to a port. So the claims on territory run both ways, and that's the point I want to make here.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And on that note, in terms of claims and counterclaims, another important player in this mix is Al-Shabab, the terrorist organization that has been active in Somalia for since the early 2000s, and it's condemned this agreement between Ethiopia and Somaliland. I'm wondering, how much of a factor is it in the Somaliland region? Does it have an operating zone in this area?
Al-Shabab does not have a particularly strong presence in Somaliland. There are elements of Al-Shabab, elements of ISIS that have not a particularly significant, but do have some sort of marginal presence in the kind of the border areas between Puntland and Somaliland. But historically, these kinds of movements really have not had much quarter or much relevance in Somaliland proper. So in that sense, I don't think Al-Shabab is a real consideration, but I think Al-Shabab is relevant maybe in some other ways. And there is a fear, and it's a fear expressed by the Somali political elite themselves, but also a lot of Somalia's external partners in the counterterrorism fight against Al-Shabab, that what the MOU will do is boost Al-Shabab's sort of political and military fortunes. It would boost their military fortunes if, in fact, there is open conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, because the Somali government would be distracted, although I don't think a military conflict is likely at this juncture. We also have to remember that there are, and we haven't talked about this yet, but there is an African Union military mission in Somalia today. It's called ATMIS. It used to be called AMISOM, that is being used to contain, corral, and defeat Al-Shabab along with Somalia's own military capabilities. And Ethiopia, as a frontline state, is a very big contributor to this mission. And so if the MOU worsens Somalia-Ethiopia relations to the point that Ethiopia is asked or forced to pull out or decides to pull out from Somalia, then that's going to create further operational space for Al-Shabab. And then there's a question of just political consequences of the MOU and a feeling that what the MOU does is mobilize sort of hyper-nationalist sentiment in Somalia, while at the same time making the federal government of Somalia, the authorities in Mogadishu, seem politically impotent in the face of Ethiopian sort of encroachment. And what this has the effect of doing is basically boosting Al-Shabab's political fortunes because they can situate themselves as the true, real defenders of the Somali cause in the face of Ethiopian aggression. And so I think Al-Shabab and Al-Shabab's trajectory are implicated in the MOU in some important ways.
Right. And so we have states involved, we have kind of proto-states involved, and then there are also non-state actors that have a vote in all this. Now, we've talked about the MOU in a notional sense, but I'm wondering, how practical is it? How viable is it economically? Because, Ethiopia has borrowed billions of dollars to develop a railway that connects its capital, Addis Ababa, to Djibouti. And so it needs cargo revenue on that railway route to repay those loans. So if, for example, it starts to use this alternative route through Somaliland, it would not be using, ostensibly would not be using at least some of that railway, if not the whole thing. And so, I'm wondering, how practical is this in that sense? And there would have to be new connectivity that would have to be developed anyway, right? And so who would pay for that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think something certainly that observers have noted is sort of the practicalities of actually implementing this MOU. And I really must emphasize it remains to be seen. There are many agreements and kind of economic arrangements that are made and signed in the Horn of Africa. It's not just about Ethiopia. It's a broader issue. And there's they're announced, and there is, there's a lot of discussion, and there's media coverage. And then a few years later, you sort of realize that nothing has really materialized in terms of sort of practical implementation on the ground. I think the practical constraint here is not so much, I think there's enough Ethiopian trade to go around, in the sense that in the context of real economic growth and development, Ethiopia is going to have multiple ports, right? And I don't think there's necessarily, I think there are, so it's not necessarily a zero-sum game in terms of, what might happen to the Djibouti port, right? And making that a viable corridor, right? Because you could have, Ethiopia is big enough, its economy has enough potential to where both a corridor through Somaliland and a corridor through Djibouti could thrive, and potentially some other corridors as well, the Lamu corridor to Kenya and so on. So, but I think the economics or the practical realities, I think, operate on some other levels. One, can you build the enabling infrastructure to make a corridor through Somaliland actually viable, right? Now, interestingly, before the MOU, there was already an arrangement for Ethiopia to use a Somaliland port called Berbera. It was called the Berbera Corridor Project. And that requires a lot of investment, not just to build port facilities, but to build the enabling infrastructure and transportation corridors that you've mentioned. And so it remains to be seen whether sufficient resources can be brought to bear to actually build this corridor. Now, one solution, and this is important, this gets to the broader geopolitics of this, is that there's been a lot of investment, particularly from the Emiratis, to make the Berbera Corridor project possible, right? So a number of years ago, they pledged something like $500 million to build the port facility, and refurbish and enhance a port facility in Berbera, Somaliland. There's been some follow-on investment to expand transportation corridors and networks, enabling infrastructure. And so part of the answer, I think, is foreign investment, and particularly Emirati investment. And the Emiratis have particularly good relations with Prime Minister Abi's government, and also the government political authorities in Somaliland. Now, I think another sort of capacity constraint that we also have to consider, and I'll pause after this, is on the naval side. We have to be clear that what the MOU is about is not necessarily commercial access to a Somaliland port, but naval access, right? To lease territory on Somaliland's coast and have an Ethiopian naval presence on the coast. But as we know, as we look in historical perspective, building a navy is an extraordinary resource intensive effort, and it remains to be seen whether Ethiopia is going to get the kind of assistance it needs to actually construct a real and genuine maritime capability on the Gulf of Aden. That's going to be, again, very resource intensive. There'll be technical barriers. They'll need support from certain friends. I mean, the French have proffered their support in prior years. So we'll see where all of this goes.
Right, and that was going to be my next question. And at this point, Ethiopia is landlocked, so it doesn't really have. I think it had to decommission most, if not all, of its naval assets, and so it would essentially have to build one from scratch. And so there's a lot that has to be built in terms of infrastructure and resources to meet these aspirations for both a commercial presence as well as a military presence in along the Red Sea.
Yeah, and just a quick side. I mean, Ethiopia does have kind of civilian maritime capabilities. It has vessels that often dock in Djibouti, but it doesn't. You're absolutely right. It doesn't have a naval capability to speak of. At least it hasn't since Eritrea's departure in 1993.
Right, and you touched upon earlier, some important notes. You kind of hinted at this competition that exists in the region in terms of connectivity. So we have multiple states in the broader East Africa region that want to serve as an outlet for Ethiopian trade. So we have, Djibouti is really the main actor right now, but Kenya has the Lamu port that it's developing. And then also has its Mombasa port, which has been operating. It's a historic port and has been expanded, I think, by the Japanese in recent years. Tanzania is not contiguous with Ethiopia, but it's also trying to get in the mix. And we have competing railway networks as well, standard gauge railways in Kenya and Tanzania. And so, there's a lot going on here in terms of potential. And alongside that potential, there's also the risk of overcapacity, at least in terms of the short term. Now, I wanted to touch on this issue of federalism and fragmentation in Ethiopia and Somalia. You talked about the role of clan in Somalia, and you also talked about the different sort of ethnic groups in Ethiopia and this challenge between kind of center and periphery. There are calls for greater federalism to address the interests and the demands of Somalia's federating units, and one of them is Somaliland. But I'm wondering, is that a real solution for Somalia's problems? Because when we look at the case of Ethiopia, some say it demonstrates sort of the downsides of federalism, or maybe an extreme form of federalism. I'd like you to just sort of unpack this problem in both countries of this issue, the relationship between federalism and fragmentation.
Sure. So this is a good question, Arif, and not an easy one to answer. I mean, I think, I'll confess, I'm not 100% sure whether federalism, as it in principle or as it exists in Ethiopia and Somalia, is the solution to the problem of sort of developing coherent and productive relations between various communities in these very diverse countries. But what I can say is that federalism was a product of political realities in both countries that really made federalism unavoidable, right? I mean, there was, when federal systems were enacted in both of these states, it was really difficult to imagine any political model that would have been tractable or workable or sort of held these countries together in really any coherent way. So, I mean, let's just take the case of Ethiopia, right? I mean, the federalism in Ethiopia and it's ethnic federalism in the Ethiopian context, right? I mean, ethnic federalism is enacted in the early 1990s in the aftermath of a long-running civil war in Ethiopia, which I think, as I mentioned earlier in discussion, pitted the successive Ethiopian regimes occupying central state power in Addis against groups and communities violently mobilized in the Ethiopian periphery. And the thing that happened in Ethiopia in the late 1990s is that the periphery basically won, right? And a coalition of armed groups from Eritrea and Tigray and from the Oromo region sweep into Addis Ababa and occupy state power. And because they came from the periphery, because of their historic ambivalence about the Ethiopian state, and because of violent mobilizations that still existed in various parts of the country, their calculation was the only way to really hold the country together, the only way that sort of makes sense to us in this context, is to try and, at least nominally, decentralize power and federalize our political system, to give various communities across Ethiopia sort of the autonomy from the central Ethiopian state that they've historically demanded. And so again, there was really difficult to imagine in that context a political alternative to the ethnic federal model in Ethiopia at that time. I mean, to be clear, there are very big critics of ethnic federalism, and there are legitimate questions raised about this model in Ethiopia then as now. But the political realities as such were that, again, there was probably no other path that was likely to be pursued given the violent mobilizations in various parts of the country and the ideology and ideas and historical experience of those that now govern the Ethiopian state. In Somalia, it's sort of an interesting sort of parallel story in that Somali's federal model is essentially enacted in about 2011, 2012. That's when a new constitution is brought on the table and the federal government of Somalia is created. It builds upon earlier discussions that date back to 2004 and the Arctic Conference in Djibouti that Somali elites, sort of conversations Somali elites were having at that time about how to rebuild the Somali state in the wake of really troubling collapse of central government institutions. And the conclusion that they drew in this period leading up to 2012 was that a federal model was really the only acceptable way to bring Somalia's various sort of clan constituencies together. Remember, Somali was basically by the 2000s, basically a kind of hodgepodge sort of patchwork of clan fiefdoms, right? Of sort of where authority is being monopolized by sort of variety of clan militia, and that the only way to make these various clan constituencies come together under a truly national framework was to make sure that you built a Somali state that would not really be able to be predatory in the way that earlier Somali states had been, particularly under Siad Barre. And so they built a federal structure that would preserve, at least in principle, some autonomy and some power for federal units. And the federal units are mostly based on clan constituencies, right? And so that, again, it was, as in Ethiopia, the federal model was a byproduct of the overall political context. And so, again, Arif, that's not really an answer to your question. Is federalism the solution? I'm not sure, but it was sort of unavoidable in the way that it's emerged.
Right, and we've touched on this a bit, but I want to unpack the role of outside powers. When we look at East Africa, the broader East Africa region, it's an area of contestation between regional and great powers, including the U.S., China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And this is primarily because of its location along this Europe, Africa, Asia maritime trade route. And at the moment in Djibouti, for example, we have 5 countries with military bases there. It's home to China's first overseas military base. A Chinese state-owned company operates the container port there. Let's start with Turkey. This is a country that has a pretty outsized role in Somalia. It just signed a defense deal with the federal government of Somalia, in which it would train and equip Somalia's naval forces. There's also an offshore oil and gas exploration deal. Do you see this as a response to Ethiopia's Somaliland deal? And how important is it?
Again, excellent questions. Let me just sort of underscore a point you've made. I mean, the Horn of Africa today is a geopolitical hot zone, right? Because of its proximity to the Red Sea, east-west trade routes. And I would just add, it's always been a geopolitical hot zone, right? I mean, dating back to the 1950s and 1960s and the 1970s. I think what's interesting is that geopolitical competition, or what may be different today, is that in prior eras, geopolitical competition in the Horn of Africa by externals was really dominated by the world's major powers, right? The Soviets, the United States, to some extent, the Europeans, particularly the British. But today, I think what's interesting is that the geopolitical competition we see in the Horn is characterized by a lot of middle power engagement and involvement. So enterprising middle powers from the Middle East are really quite relevant at the current moment. You mentioned Turkey, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also the Emiratis, the Saudis, Qatar, Iran to some extent, although a lesser extent on the Horn of Africa littoral. And this is a pretty significant change, I would say, in the geopolitical environment. Now, on the issue of Turkey, I don't read Turkey's recent defense arrangement with Somalia as necessarily being all about the MOU. I mean, the reality is Turkey has been deepening its engagement across the African continent really since the mid-2000s for a variety of reasons. And certainly, I would say since about 2012, it's really began to ratchet up that engagement. So its involvement in Somalia predates the recent, the MOU. They have had, provided through civil society and the Turkish government a lot of assistance and support to Somalia, particularly in the aftermath of a major famine in Somalia in 2012. They have some military facilities in Somalia. They've trained Somali troops. There are a lot of Somali military officers and civil servants that receive training and education in Turkey. There is a pretty important set of precedents, I think, for the recent defense partnership. Again, we don't know the details of what it will look like. But I'll also add that Turkey's involvement in the Horn of Africa is not simply about Somalia, right? I mean, it also has a pretty important multifaceted relationship with Ethiopia as well, right? And so I think from Turkey's perspective, this is important. I don't think what it's doing in Somalia today is necessarily about Ethiopia, right? It sees Ethiopia itself as an important partner in the region. So a number of Turkish firms, including on the industrial side, have operations in Ethiopia. I think access to natural resources and commodities is also an important issue. And also there's a defense relationship between Ethiopia and Turkey. So there are a lot of defense articles, including drones, that have been sold to the Ethiopian government. That was a defense partnership that was really important at the height of the Tigray War, when Tigrayan forces were making advances against the Ethiopian government. They relied on military support from the Emiratis, but also Turkey and Turkish drones. And then, of course, Turkey has a broader set of economic relationships and defense relationships across the Horn. In Sudan, I think that's another notable place. Again, Turkey is really, I guess the point I'm making here is that Turkey's interest and engagement in this region is really broad-based, quite deep.
Right. And you made a couple of great points there. One about the outsized role of middle powers, external middle powers in this region. And then two, about how, Turkey isn't really playing a kind of a zero-sum game here. It has a very, it's among the, I think it was the first country to establish an embassy in Somalia post-Civil War, and has a strong relationship with the federal government of Somalia. But at the same time, it supported Abiy in this Tigray war, in this recent Tigray war, and has also constructed a rail line in Ethiopia and then elsewhere in the region. So they're quite diversified.
Yeah, and I'll also add, just another tidbit. I think President Erdogan visits Somalia in 2012, I think it was 2012. And I think at the time he visited, he was the first head of state to visit Somalia since, the state collapses in 1991. So it sort of speaks to how deep Turkey's engagement has been in Somalia and the broader region. The other thing I'll mention about Turkey, and this also applies to some other countries, some of the other Middle Eastern countries, is that part of their engagement in the Horn is not about the Horn necessarily, but about their own competition with other it's about intra-Middle Eastern competition, right? And to the extent that countries in the Middle East see the Horn as a near abroad, they want to deny advantage to potential adversaries in this region. So you could argue that a lot of what Turkey has done historically in Somalia is about denying advantage or circumscribing, for instance, Egyptian influence, or pushing back on the Emiratis and the Saudis, and vice versa, right? So there is an extent to which what Middle Eastern countries are doing in the Horn is a projection of their own rivalries in the Middle East, within the Middle East. Saudi engagement in the Horn, for instance, I think a key principle of it has been, over the last 10 to 15 years, is really to dilute and diminish Iranian influence.
Right. And the Emiratis are also a big player too, as you mentioned at the start of our discussion. And so, over the past decade or so, there's also been this rivalry between Turkey and Qatar on one side, and the Emiratis, and to some extent the Saudis on the other. But the Saudis are now kind of pulling away and doing their own thing in a more assertive fashion. Let's talk about the UAE first. The UAE has a pretty active regional role. So, for example, it helped negotiate this 2018 peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia. It also operated a port and base in Asab in from 2015 to 2021 when it was conducting this war in Yemen. What is its position on the Somaliland question? Because we've seen some other countries, for example, the Saudis, have taken a vocal stance in favor of the federal government of Somalia's sovereignty. What is the UAE's position on the Somaliland question?
I think the Emiratis have a more sort of complicated position on the Somaliland question. So on the one hand, it's absolutely the case that they retain good relations with Somaliland and also very good relations with Ethiopia, both economic relations, but also political and security relationship as well. And I think one illustration of the close partnership that the Emiratis maintain with both of these actors is the Berbera port deal, which I had mentioned arlier on in our discussion, right? Where they're effectively going to invest billions of dollars in developing both refurbishing or expanding the Berbera port, building the enabling infrastructure between Ethiopia and Somaliland, and then also going to play a role, I think, through DP World, Dubai Ports World, a big Emirati conglomerate, in actually commercially managing the Berbera port. So they, again, have close relations with both Somalia and Ethiopia, deeply sort of invested in their partnership and have vested economic interests. On the other hand, the Emiratis also have a partnership and a relationship with the Somali government in Mogadishu. Now, under the previous President Farmajo of Somalia, relations between the Emiratis and Somalia actually became quite difficult. But under President Hassan Sheikh, the current president of Somalia, I think Emirati Mogadishu relations have gotten better. They've improved, and the UAE does provide some military support to Mogadishu. Right, it also has a small military facility in Somalia. They train troops. They provide military assistance of various types. So that's why the Emiratis have a more complex posture position on the MOU than the Saudis or certainly the Egyptians. But I think the Egyptians' posture on the MOU is really about Ethiopia and their rivalry with Ethiopia.
Right. And I think some Emirati forces were actually killed in a recent attack by Al-Shabab in Somalia.
Exactly.
And so, some have alleged that the Emiratis may have a hand in this Ethiopia-Somaliland deal. But as you characterize it, it seems more like that they're hedging, and I think they have the space to do that because they're not physically connected to these countries, and also because a lot of these projects are very far from fruition. So there's not really, any real equity, let's say, in terms that they're investing here in terms of ports and things like that, at least in recent years. Now, it seems like there is some low degree of competition between the Saudis and the Emiratis in the Horn. Do you see that as significant right now? Is that something we should be watching out for?
No, I think it is an important trend that we need to watch, right? I mean, the competition between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. I mean, the Egyptians on some level have been pulled into this on the side of Saudi Arabia, but of course it's not. I mean, it's not public or overt competition. It's soft. It's behind closed doors. And I think in part what animates it, and I'm no expert on the Middle East. I mean, there are obvious issues in the Saudi-Emirati bilateral relationship, but I think both the Saudis and the Egyptians are nervous, are somewhat uncomfortable by the manner in which the Emiratis have been projecting power into the Red Sea, quite aggressively, heavily involved in the Sudanese civil war on the side of the RSF. I've mentioned the relationship between the Emiratis and Ethiopia, their role in Somalia. And I think both the Saudis and the Egyptians sort of feel like, look, the Red Sea is we are Red Sea countries. This is our backyard historically. And the Emiratis, I think, have garnered too much influence. And it's played out in a variety of ways. I mean, when the Saudis a number of years ago, with the Egyptian support, developed something called the Red Sea Council, which was supposed to be a multilateral fora for cooperation on Red Sea issues, they very deliberately excluded the Emiratis. Of course, the Emiratis are not a littoral Red Sea country, but an important stakeholder. We're not particularly supportive. This is another example. Saudis were not particularly supportive of bringing the Emiratis, for instance, into peace negotiations in Sudan. Tried to sort of, I wouldn't say marginalize them, but weren't really keen on seeing them as a major stakeholder in this important conflict on the Red Sea littoral. So again, yeah, I think it is a trend and dynamic to watch. It's not super overt. It's not an in-your-face competition, but it is there playing out behind closed doors.
Right. So something more along the lines of competition as opposed to conflict. Now, few geopolitical discussions are complete without talking about the role of China. And China has a big role in the broader Horn of Africa and East Africa region. It's a big backer of Abiy, and Ethiopia has also been, one of its largest recipients of development financing through the Belt and Road Initiative. And there's also been considerable Chinese investment in manufacturing industries and in Ethiopia. But China also operates the Djibouti port, and it wants the loans for the railway that it's constructed from Addis Ababa to Djibouti repaid. So I'm wondering, do you have a sense of the Chinese perspective on all this? It seems like the Somaliland port deal would reduce Ethiopia's dependence on the Dorla port, which it operates, and potentially, Ethiopia's ability to repay the loans for the railway that China has financed and constructed.
I think you're certainly right that China has an interest in the continued viability and success of the Djibouti-Ethiopia corridor because of their previous investments and some of the loans that they've made and they sort of hope to collect on. So I think that is true. But the Chinese have economic interests really across this region. They have other investments across Ethiopia. They have investments in Eritrea, other parts of Djibouti, certainly in Somalia. So I think they are not likely, and they certainly haven't proven likely to take sort of make their presence felt on this particular issue and sort of lean one way or another. Now they have, I think I should add here, they do have a somewhat difficult relationship with Somaliland and are certainly closer to Mogadishu. And part of the reason for that, I think there are two issues. One, because of the Taiwan issue, China doesn't really want to give any succor to de facto states in the international system. But the other piece is that Somaliland, a couple of years ago, embarked on developing very close ties with Taiwan itself, and that really upset China. So I think the Chinese view is, I don't think they're particularly keen on Somaliland writ large, and that's just independent of the port deal. And so I think that's just something to note. But more generally, I would say, look, I think the Chinese are very careful in this region about being perceived as using a heavy hand politically or intervening in the region's disputes. Right, they are an important economic player, but I think on political questions, they kind of shrink into the background. Yes, there is China has a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. They've hosted multilateral conferences on sort of peace and security issues in the past. But they are not really engaging on political questions, peace and security questions in the Horn of Africa in the way, for instance, the United States is sort of on a more overt basis.
Yeah. And so, you made some, very interesting points about the Taiwan-Somaliland factor, one in the sense that the two situations, their contexts are somewhat analogous in that they're both proto-states and they're looking for recognition globally. Taiwan sort of on the losing end of that now, continues to lose states that have recognized it in the past. And then at the same time, in terms of the lobbying game, especially in Washington, there seems to be kind of an attempt by Somaliland-aligned entities to kind of use Taiwan as a force multiplier in Washington. And so for China, there's at least two major reasons why it wouldn't want to do anything to facilitate or accelerate Somaliland's drift towards independence. And then also Africa in general is very important reputationally for China. It's a way for it to kind of distinguish. It's a platform through which China tries to distinguish itself from the so-called global North or the West. And so, Chinese foreign ministers generally make these, high-profile visits to Africa as a way of signaling its importance to them in terms of their foreign policy. And so I think getting too deep into these interstate disputes would problematize those ambitions for being perceived as a better actor compared to the West. Because once you get into the nitty gritty, then it gets very complicated, and you have people that are protesting against you, and it's maybe in its interest to kind of free ride to some degree on the diplomatic front. And just practically, in terms of Ethiopia's potential to redevelop a naval presence, do you think China would be a major player in terms of providing that type of hardware, those assets that Ethiopia would need? Should it pursue a base agreement with Somaliland?
I think it really depends, right, on the manner in which this deal is realized, right? I mean, if there is a consensus between Ethiopia and Somalia on the MOU, if an understanding is reached, if it's a consensus that includes other countries in the region whose interests might be implicated, like Djibouti, then I think China, and I would say some other external parties that might otherwise be reticent, might come in to help support Ethiopia's desire to build its naval capabilities. But if this arrangement, the MOU, is pushed forward in the current context of rancor, disagreement, if it continues to fuel regional rivalry, then I think a lot of externals that might otherwise support building Ethiopia's naval capacity will be reluctant to do so. I don't think they'll want to bear the costs in terms of their relations with others across the Horn to go about sort of building these capabilities. So the manner in which this arrangement is realized, I think, is really quite important, particularly from China's perspective, which, as you note, simply doesn't want the exposure of sort of taking sides in regional conflicts, be seen to be doing that. And I would just say, and we haven't talked about it, but I mean, this would apply to the United States as well, right? I mean, I think in principle, the U.S. doesn't. In principle, I think the U.S. and I would say the West more generally isn't opposed to Ethiopia cultivating or garnering maritime access, sea access, whether that be commercial or military. But I think the manner in which that is done is quite important then. And remember, I mean, this is not simply about the Horn. There's also the sort of broader international implications. Like what precedent is set by realizing an MOU like this without the appropriate kind of regional consensus. So
right, and the United States also has counterterrorism concerns. It's been long involved in the conflict in Somalia.
That's absolutely, that's a huge issue, and I think there are concerns in Washington about what this means for the fight against Al-Shabab, where the U.S. is very invested. That's a very important point.
And so when we talk about U.S. interests here, we've talked a lot about the strategic and economic dimension and great and middle power rivalry. But for the U.S., would you say that the risks to U.S. counterterrorism and interests in the region take precedence above all other elements in this Ethiopia-Somaliland dynamic?
Yeah, so I think the United States, let's first just characterize the U.S. posture on the MOU. And I would say the U.S. reaction has been cool, right? I mean, I don't think they're not particularly pleased with the MOU and the way in which it's been rolled out, it's been introduced. And I think the reason is that they see it as further catalyzing regional conflict and regional instability. And remember, this is a region more broadly where there is really, I think what we've seen over the last few years is sort of metastasizing conflict between the region states and within them. And I think the feeling is amongst decision makers, as far as I can tell, is that we don't need another regional fault line. And to the extent that the MOU is producing that, it's a real problem, right? We've got a civil war in Sudan, which the United States is engaged in trying to resolve. There were more recently Ethiopia-Eritrea tensions, civil conflict in Ethiopia. Later, on top of course, the problem of Al-Shabab in Somalia, conflict in Somaliland's eastern regions of Sanaag and Sul. I mean, we could go on down the list, and all of this playing out next to the world's I-95, right? One of the most important maritime corridors to global trade, right? And so I think that explains in part sort of how Washington is sort of responding. And diplomatically, I think what they're saying to the Ethiopians is, look, let's put this MOU on the back burner and let's figure out if we can find some other formula for you to enhance maritime and sea access. Right? We understand the economic constraints that you face in this domain, but the MOU perhaps is not the answer because it is furthering conflict and tension with Somalia and the region more broadly. Because other countries in the region also haven't received this very well. So can we figure out some other mechanism to further your sea access? Right? Is there a way that we can reduce service charges in Djibouti? Can we help you build port infrastructure in the direction of other ports? Something that would stop well short of maybe military access or a military base or direct control of a port, but would ease your economic burdens.
Right. And we also have the Houthi attacks on naval vessels in the Red Sea region. So the broader area has no shortage of problems. Final question. In the weeks and months ahead, what should we be looking out for? So, for example, we have some have warned of the risk of a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Do you see that as possible?
I mean, it is, and it's something I've written about in recent months. It is a risk, absolutely, that I think needs to be watched. I don't necessarily think it's likely, in part because neither side can really afford a direct conflict, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. Now, it should be noted that on some level, the Somaliland-Ethiopia MOU reduces the likelihood of conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea because now Ethiopia's maritime ambitions have been directed towards Somaliland rather than towards Eritrea and the port of Assab. But at the same time, Ethiopia-Eritrea tensions are and have been about more than simply port access. There are a broader set of questions we probably don't have time to get into that sort of separate Ethiopia and Eritrea, including the Tigray conflict, including the Amhara question in Ethiopia, including where each of these countries sits in the regional pecking order, and so on. We could go on down the list. I think there are other sort of hot spots to watch across the region. The war in Sudan, I think, is taken a really dangerous turn over the last 4 or 5 months. We'll see if that conflict, if we can get at least a pause to that conflict and maybe some traction on a broader political settlement. I'm not encouraged about that possibility, but we'll certainly see. There are Ethiopia's internal conflicts that have ratcheted up in recent months, particularly in the Amhara region. I think that's an area of concern. In Somalia, Somalia is at a really important turning point, in part because we are at a moment now where the African Union mission in Somalia is in a sort of drawdown phase. And security responsibilities for key parts of the country are being transferred to the Somali military, to Somali security forces. And there is a risk that transition doesn't work, right? And a vacuum is created that allows Al-Shabab to kind of surge. And so we'll have to watch that quite critically. And then, look, you've mentioned Gaza, you've mentioned the Houthis and Red Sea issues. We also have to be aware of how those kinds of dynamics can spill over across the Red Sea into the Horn of Africa and catalyze increased competition between Middle Eastern powers in the Horn.
And that was Dr. Michael Woldemariam of the University of Maryland, College Park. Please subscribe to our show on your platform of choice, and thank you for tuning in.